Just a moment. To discuss this, we're joined by Cornelia Meyer, who's the Chief Executive of the business consultancy MRL Corporation. Cornelia, very nice to have you back on the program. The Financial Times and the Saudis are under pressure, obviously, to boost oil production. Prices have been above 100 for some time. Boosting it could bring them down. But as you look at the story, you just get the sense that it cannot be seen without looking at the context of U.S. politics and the rivalry with Iran.
No, absolutely, and I think that is it. What does Saudi Arabia want? Saudi Arabia, and what's the mission of OPEC as well? It's to keep the world adequately supplied with oil. And if prices go too high, then obviously there is a feeling, even if it's adequately supplied, the markets feel it's not adequately supplied, so they're boosting production. And especially in the context of the U.S. election, there's nothing in it for Saudi, nothing in it for OPEC if prices go too high.
Well, just talk us through what's driving up prices at the moment, because we've got, I mean, the article talks about the fact that Brent crude, for example, since June this year is up 33% to just under $118 a barrel. That was Friday's price. It's come down since then, obviously, on the news of this Saudi boost.
Yeah, and a lot of it is the geopolitical tensions. People are worried about, what's happening in Iran, and the saber rattling around Iran doesn't help. And what has last week pushed them up also the last few days is all these attacks in the Middle East on embassies because of the film. Now, these were not really oil-producing countries or major oil producers. Libya is an oil producer. But again, people feel so worried about the geopolitical stability in the Middle East that is a psychological more than anything else boost to the prices.
Because in terms of demand for oil, that's actually gone down significantly, hasn't it?
It
kind of doesn't make sense, does
it? It's irrational. But then markets are all about psychology. They're not always only about supply and demand, yes. Unfortunately.
We know that only too well, don't we?
Anyway, let's move on to the business page of the Daily Telegraph. News, obviously, that you're covering as well. Sadly, the lawmen strikers have agreed to a deal, a 22% pay rise. It's a story that has been running for quite some time. It's still uncertain whether or not this is, ties up the entire package. But other mines, the Anglo-Americans, Platinum Mine has resumed as well. But I suppose the question that I would ask you is this a short-term fix? Because there is a political season coming up in South Africa. The issue of nationalization and ownership of mines has not been resolved since the end of apartheid. This could bounce back again.
I think it could bounce back again, and a lot of it is how do you treat miners, how happy do they feel, and compensation is a part of it. What we always have to look at also is with lawmen, with all the problems, they're now in breach of a few bank covenants, and so where will that go? So the problems for that particular miner are not over with the workers coming back to work.
But also the problems for the industry are not over either, because it's very likely, isn't it, that miners working elsewhere finding out what was the end result of this dispute, a 22% pay rise. That's quite a bit more than Lonmin was offering. I mean, they're going to think, hey, hang on a second, surely we should go down the same road.
Absolutely, and I mean, where I would look at is also, I would look at China and coal mining, because if you look at the conditions of coal miners in China, it's not terribly good, and at some stage, the coal miners in China will also raise their voices, I'm pretty certain.
The International Herald Tribune reports on China's interest in the Arctic and focuses on its effort to claim a stake in a very resource-rich region of the world. They are planning on establishing an outpost. They're sending ships out there. And what I find interesting is that they're arguing that they are actually a near-Arctic nation and therefore have an interest in it. I mean, last time I checked my geography, perhaps I see a slightly different...
You didn't use a Chinese map, that's the problem. but there's underlying that is something very interesting, because if you look at the US or, us in the West, we look at energy security in terms of if we have markets and they're well supplied, we're secure. The Chinese, to a lesser extent the Indians, say unless we actually own the minerals in the ground, we are not secure. So that's to be seen in this wider context of the Chinese oil and gas companies trying to get equity minerals in the ground throughout the world. Africa is a good example for that.
I mean, the International Herald Tribune's headline says it's a resource race. Is it a resource race?
In the
or
Arctic,
is China
absolutely.
Really just kind of out there and likely to win?
China is turning this into a resource race, if anything.
But who really should take ownership or control of this? Because there's a reference to this 8-nation international body. But in the same story, of course, China is referring to the Arctic as a worldwide resource. If only 8 nations are responsible for administering a part of the world that arguably the rest of the world has some interest in entitlement.
Absolutely, and you could argue this if you're China and also the very Arctic nation of India, if you have a billion plus people, it is important to you what happens to those resources.
Let's look now at South China Morning Post, various stories on the front page, not least China's defense minister saying in no uncertain terms to his counterpart from Washington, when it comes to the China-Japan row, don't get involved.
Yeah, and it's not just the China-Japan row, because you have that particular set of islands. You also have the Spratly Islands, which is a row between China and there's oil there. China, Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia. So that's the next thing. So again, China asserting herself. In terms of, we are building the greater Chinese empire, so to say.
But could it be, to some extent, cutting one's nose to spite their face, in the sense that, Sally, I think you were just reporting that some Japan's shutting down some of its factories in China temporarily as a result of what's going on. They employ Chinese workers, and at the end of the day, it affects its own citizens.
But it's a gigantic China-Japan trade is gigantic, and if you look at Japanese exports to China, they're slightly bigger than Chinese exports to Japan. So they have to come to an agreement. There's just too much at stake.
Now let's have a look at The Guardian. Russia to write off $11 billion worth of debt to boost North Korea relations. Tell us more about this story.
That's incredibly good news, because what we all want is to bind Korea more into the global community, so they stop, acting up on nuclear weapons and things like that, getting Russia involved, getting China involved, trying to get them for economic well-being to behave a little bit more sensibly is probably very, very good news.
Be interesting to see the reaction, on this from North Korea. Obviously, new leadership there, Kim Jong-un, who we still don't know much about.
No, he's very young.
Exactly. And
but
anyway,
he's asserted himself. He's gotten rid of a lot of the generals and people of his father. So we'll see where that goes.
Now to our final story in the Times. Germany's top banker referencing a bit of literature here in terms of the Eurozone crisis, describing plans to buy Eurozone bonds as the work of the devil, referencing Goethe's classic. I wonder what book you have tried Dickens' Hard Times to describe what's going on. Things fall apart by a
No, I would say I would have Dickens' Hard Times, and I think it's rather cheeky of to call Mr. Draghi, to liken Mr. Draghi to Mephistopheles. And on a more serious note here, it's the question here is, do we want the Eurozone to survive? And if you look at the mandate of the Eurozone, of the ECB, it's important to also look at employment, as does the central bank in the US.
Very briefly, though, Cornelia, where are you on the debate about, the buying up of sovereign bonds? Is it the work of the devil, as the Germans believe, or will it rescue the Eurozone?
I think we're in last chance saloon, and this is the one thing that can rescue the euro, in my view.
Cornelia Meyer of MRL Corporation, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate it. Always good to see you on the program. That is all we have on our newspaper review.